Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this session, which is part of the Constance Baker Motley Speaker Series on racial inequality established by the Connecticut Bar Association and the Connecticut Bar Foundation. We look forward to continuing to explore topics related to racial inequality. My name is Anya Goldsby. I am an attorney at Letizia Ambrose and Falls and also the founder of Black Esquire LLC and the Value Coach. Constance Baker Motley was a trailblazing civil rights attorney who became the nation's first African-American female to serve as a federal judge and later chief judge. Judge Motley was born in New Haven, Connecticut, and maintained strong connections to Connecticut throughout her life. Tonight's session is titled The Rage of Innocence, Race and the Criminalization of Adolescent Behavior. We will feature a powerful presentation by Professor Chris Henning, who will highlight findings from her book, The Rage of Innocence, How America Criminalizes Black Youth. At the close of the session, we hope you will provide feedback on today's presentation using the survey link provided in the chat. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening, Professor Chris Henning. Chris Henning is a nationally recognized advocate, author, trainer, and consultant on the intersection of race, adolescence, and the policing of Black youth. She is the Bloom Professor of Law and Director of Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative at Georgetown Law, and was previously the lead attorney of the Juvenile Unit at the Public Defender Service for the District of Columbia. Chris has been representing children accused of crime for more than 26 years and is the co-founder of a number of initiatives to combat racial injustice in the juvenile and criminal legal systems, including the Ambassadors for Racial Justice Program and a Racial Justice Toolkit for Youth Defenders. Chris also trained state actors across the country on the impact of racial bias on youth in the courts and the traumatic effects of over-policing and hyper-surveillance. She has received several awards, including the 2021 Leadership Prize from the Juvenile Law Center and the 2022 Women of Distinction Award from the American Association of University Women. Chris has written many articles and other publications advocating for reform in the juvenile legal system. Her book, The Rage of Innocence, How America Criminalizes Black Youth, was published by Penguin Random House in September 2021 and was featured on the front page of the New York Times Book Review and received rave reviews in the Washington Post. The book was awarded a 2022 Media for a Just Society Award by Evident Change and the 2022 Social Justice Advocacy Award from the In the Margins Book Awards Committee. Please join me in welcoming Professor Chris Henning. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anya, and thank you everyone on the committee for the Constance Baker Motley Speaker Series. I am very honored to be here with you today. I want our session today to be interactive. So the chat feature has been enabled for you. There will be points during the presentation where I will ask you to engage with me by chat. So the way I want to start is to circle back to something that Anya said, which is I am currently representing children in delinquency cases in Washington, D.C. And I have been representing children for the last 26 years. What is so profound and disturbing about that is that in that entire 26 years, I have only represented 4 white children. That's it. Every other child that I have represented has been an African-American child. For those of you who, aren't very familiar with Washington, D.C., might be thinking that white children aren't, that there aren't any white children in the nation's capital, or that white children don't commit crime. And I imagine that all of us know that is not true. So it's really became hard for me to do the work that I do for as long as I have without beginning to ask some of the really hard questions that I think every one of us should be asking. The first question is, why is it that these extreme disparities exist, not just in Washington, D.C., but all across the country, all 50 states? And I wanted to know, how are these disparities impacting Black children in particular, but you will see that much of the research that I've done also speaks to Latino children, other youth of color who are disproportionately overrepresented in their systems, in their states, in their cities. And I wanted to know how these disparities were impacting Black and brown youth mentally, physically, psychologically, developmentally, and especially important for this conversation that we're having here today, when we think about inequities in the law, I wanted to know how the law is impacted at the intersection of race, adolescence, and trauma, like the psychological trauma that comes from being criminalized and being over policed in the ways that we often see. So as Anya said, I wrote a book called The Rage of Innocence: How America Criminalizes Black Youth. And in that book, I talk about some of my clients and the stories that my clients shared with me and that I witnessed for myself, as well as stories of other young people across the country who have been impacted by the juvenile and criminal legal system. And I think I want to share a story that with you about a client that I represented that I call Charisse, for purposes of the book and for purposes of a conversation like we're having today. And I think Charisse's story really captures what we see across the system. So Charisse was a 17-year-old girl who got into an argument with her boyfriend. She got into that argument at school. During the course of the argument, she grabbed her boyfriend's cell phone and began to walk away down the hall. As she's walking away, she is scrolling through her boyfriend's text messages to see whether or not he has been texting with someone, with another girl. A police officer, a school resource officer, sees this and decides to intervene. And I ask all of you to think about, can you imagine what his intervention was? His intervention was to arrest her. So this child gets arrested for this argument with her boyfriend. She's arrested in the hallway in front of her classmates, in front of her teacher, and she is held in secure detention overnight and then brought to court and prosecuted the next day for robbery. And as many of you know, robbery is a serious violent felon. So now I have this client who looks like a serious felon, a serious violent child on paper, when in reality, she is a child engaged in normal adolescent responses. And so when I talk about the prosecution and detention of children in the juvenile and criminal legal system, people automatically assume that I must be talking about serious violent offenses, the offenses that we are most afraid of: rape, murder, real robberies, not the robbery that Charisse committed, burglary, gun cases, carjackings. But the data is clear that very few children of any race and any class are engaged in the types of behaviors and offenses and crimes that we are most afraid of. Instead, juvenile courts are populated all across the country with young people who have engaged in behaviors that arise out of what we all know about the key features of adolescence, right? And I could even ask you in the chat to start practicing using the chat. Type in the chat, what are the key features? What is the one word that you would put in the chat that delineates or describes adolescence? What do we know about adolescence, right? Let me pause. Let you type. Yes, impulsivity. Thank you, Renee. Right? What else? Yes. No prefrontal cortex, excuse me. I love it, right? You got straight to the brain science, right? The brains are not fully developed, right? Kids are just kids, right? So what do we know? Poor judgment, thank you. So they're impulsive, reactive, emotional. They are sensation seekers, risk takers, boundary testers, right? They are also fairness fanatics, right? And exactly like Charisse was. Also, peer influence is not a myth. Teenagers do what their friends do, or better yet, they do what they think their friends are doing. They do what they think their friends want them to do, right? That's the nature of adolescence, right? I love this. Catherine added that they're escalators, that they're easily persuaded. They lack judgment, they lack wisdom. Well, here's the deal. And this is what's so important about our conversation today about the intersection of race and adolescence, is that research makes it clear that teenagers act like teenagers regardless of where they live and what they look like. That means there's no black and white adolescence, there's no Asian adolescence, there's no Latino adolescence, there's no indigenous peoples adolescence. Adolescence is just adolescence, right? And so it's really important for us to remember that all of the key features of adolescence appear across the spectrum. Yet, despite that, despite our understanding of adolescence, racial disparities are evident all over the United States, even as referrals to courts, even as youth arrest rates. Believe it or not, people, keep youth violence in the news. And so we forget that actually youth arrest and youth referral to the court system have gone down over the last 40 years. But even as those arrest rates go down, the racial disparities have only increased. They've gotten broader, right? And so what we see is that even as we get annoyed with the recklessness and the impulsivity of adolescence, for the most part, we still treat white teenagers with tolerance, grace, forgiveness, redirection, and sometimes just downright humor at the silliness and the foolishness of adolescence, right? While on the other hand, Black children are criminalized for virtually every key feature of adolescence: the clothes that they wear, the music that they listen to, the way they style their hair. Talking back to adults is treated like a threats charge. I'll say more about that. Playing on a cell phone in class results in children like the young Shakira, who was ripped out of her seat in her high school class in South Carolina. Black children are more likely to be arrested for being out after curfew, having a party, experimenting with drugs and sex, and playing with toy guns in the park. And so it's really important to understand these differences. And as Anya said, I will be taking questions at the end. If on occasion, sometimes I can see your questions pop up, sometimes I can't. But if I see them and can incorporate them where I am, I will attempt to do so. I will say in response to David that the studies, when I talk about adolescence, looks like adolescence, no matter where they live and where they come from, that includes class. And so what I'm saying at a very technical level, there have been a series of studies on the key features of adolescence. Let's take impulsivity or take peer influence, and they have controlled for socioeconomic class, right? They have controlled for race, and they have controlled for ethnicity, And what they have found is that children of all races and socioeconomic statuses end up engaging in the same or have the same key features of adolescence that we've discussed. I should also note that the researchers then did some international studies on the key features of adolescence and found that children all over the world, even in different countries, it's not just a United States phenomena, experience or exhibit these key features of adolescence. This risk-taking, peer influence, impulsivity is a natural part of adolescence. I should also note that there is what they call the crime bump of adolescence. In other words, it is true that my client Sharice engaged in behavior that technically met the elements of a robbery, right? And so during this adolescent period, we are emotional and we don't control or regulate those impulses. As a result, we engage in behaviors that are criminal. Dare I ask you to put in the chat whether you ever committed behavior that would qualify for a criminal offense when you were in adolescence. And as your lawyers, I'm advising you all not to reply in the chat. But the answer is all of us had, right? All of us had. Yes, you're long barred by the statute of limitations, but we all have. That's natural in the adolescent years for us to engage in behaviors that are criminal, but you don't see children coming to court for normal adolescent behaviors in the numbers and the proportions, right? The percentages that we see African-American children, and depending on what city you live in, other ethnic groups. So what we need to know is that there are now generations of Black and Latino youth, particularly who've been studied, and I'll talk about the studies, who have been studied, who have grown up under what they perceive to be the constant surveillance of the police, right? So in many Black and brown neighborhoods, police are parked on the street corner, driving through the neighborhoods and through the community all hours of the day and the night, asking young people, where are you coming from? Where are you going? And so that's what young people are perceiving, that they are under constant state of surveillance. They attend schools with police officers at the front door, and the research shows that the impact of that kind of constant surveillance, right, both by police officers and by civilians who have them under surveillance, right, that the impact is traumatic. In fact, there is a growing body of research documenting the extraordinary psychological trauma that young people experience. And especially the studies have shown Black and brown children, Black and Latino children experience when they live in heavily surveilled neighborhoods, attend heavily surveilled schools, or have been the target of significant stops and frisks. Those reports show that those young people, Black and Latino youth, report high rates of fear, anxiety, depression, hopelessness. Many of them become hypervigilant. And by that, I just mean that they're always on guard, not trusting police officers. And the research shows that that distrust of police officers carries over to other adult authority figures, right? So like teachers, counselors, when they end up in the court system, it transfers over to court officers, probation officers, and sometimes even the defense lawyer. What's so powerful about this research is that it shows that trauma occurs not only from being the direct target of that police contact, but also from witnessing or hearing about police aggression involving family members, friends, or someone else that they are close to. So these vicarious contacts with the police produce similar sources of stress, right, as direct contact. So just having to get up in the morning and worry about becoming a victim of police violence is in and of itself a source of stress. Research also shows that watching incidents, right? Even isolated incidents of police brutality on the television or on the internet involving people that we don't even know can be just as traumatic as being there. So a series of studies was done showing that teenagers, Black and Latino teenagers who have watched these incidents online or on television have reported post-traumatic stress disorder, symptoms associated with post-traumatic stress disorder, and other depressive symptoms. What was so powerful to me in reading about this is that this particular study was done modeling the research that was done after the Twin Towers collapsed, and people like you and me were watching those towers collapse online or on television. They did similar studies after the Boston Marathon bombing and after Hurricane Katrina, where civilians are watching television and watching people stranded on bridges. And what they found was that the observers, right, who weren't even there, weren't even in New York, Boston, or New Orleans, were suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. So they replicated those studies with teenagers watching online police violence. And one of the things that I often say here is that this is really not at all meant to be sort of an anti-police conversation. When I talk to police officers about this, I remind them that the blue uniform carries with it a history of racial relations, right? Of tension between police officers in varying forms and communities of color. And so it is the combination of that history plus this contemporary views, this contemporary images that we see on television that lead to this type of trauma. And so that even when a police officer approaches a young, Black or Latino teenager, they have to, even when they approach that teenager meaning well, like a wellness check, they have to understand that there is a lot of psychological trauma that comes even from that. I should also note that there is some powerful research showing that policing has a significant impact on sleep quality among teenagers. So I know we have lawyers in the audience, and I ask you whether you've ever shown up in court and seen one of your young clients sleeping in the hallway before a court hearing. Well, I certainly have. And I'm always sort of baffled. Why are you, sleeping? And what I realized, not only did my client likely have a really poor night's sleep the night before because they're stressed and anxious, embarrassed, maybe angry about the court hearing that they are about to have, but they also have lived with an extended period of not being able to sleep well because they lived in communities that have a significant police presence or heavy surveillance. And then as we think about one final sort of study on trauma is really understanding that policing and police encounters and surveillance has a significant impact on what we talk about as identity formation, which is just a fancy way for saying that police contact has a significant impact on how young people perceive themselves and how they think about what they can become in the future and how they think about how they fit into the rest of society. Adolescence is a time in our development when our views of law and law enforcement really become fixed in our minds. And so early negative encounters, real, perceived, direct, or vicarious, ultimately have a profound impact on how they perceive the legitimacy of policing as an institution and whether or not they believe it's even worth it to participate in mainstream society. And so the final thing I'll say on the trauma is something that I think we all know intuitively, but that extended periods of psychological trauma ultimately have a long-term impact on physical health as well. And so people who live in heavily surveilled neighborhoods, who have experienced significant stops and frisks, are more likely to have long-term health, poor health outcomes, high blood pressure, diabetes, asthma, obesity, heart attacks, all of these things. So it's really important to understand the cumulative impact. So when I talk, and so I had on for a few minutes there, I had on my academic hat, right? But I'm also very much a practitioner, and I work with real people. I represent real clients. And so when I talk about the research on race and trauma, I worry about us over intellectualizing it. And I want us to think about this in real terms, how it affects people on the ground, lived experiences in our communities. And so one way to do that is to hear from folks who have experiences or contact with the police. So what I want to do for you is I want to play a short clip for you. And after we play the clip, I'm gonna ask you to engage with me and tell me two things. I want you to be paying attention to how your body feels as you're watching this. Okay. And then second, and you may want to grab a pen so you have a pen ready, I want you to jot down exactly what Salehi Bimberry is saying to the police. And then we're going to have a quick interactive engagement by chat. All right.
Yeah, just real quick, man. So we were over here and we saw you walk across the red hand over here, so we just want to make sure, like, what's going on? How come you did that? You don't want to wait for the light?
What did I do? I'm like a little like startled.
Right here, Rodeo.
Oh, I jaywalked, I guess.
Right.
Yeah.
So we saw you, but we were gonna stop you over here, but then we decided we were just gonna come this way and talk to you. How come you did that, man?
I jaywalked. I don't know what else to say. I don't know what to say.
Okay, well, just because the area you did it, you see how there's a bus and stuff like that. We get a little.
All right, I've just been GPSing, trying to figure out where I'm going.
Okay, do you have any ID on you by chance, man? Without reaching into your pockets, you don't have any weapons or anything, right?
I don't. I'm like super nervous.
No, I get you, man. That's right. I'm not putting you in handcuffs or anything.
You want to take my phone or something like that?
No, you can hold on to it.
Right.
I don't want to.
So what do you want me to do right now?
I just wanted to see if you had any ID, but without reaching into your pockets.
I do have an ID.
Awesome. Do you have any weapons or anything?
I do not.
Okay. Do you mind if I just?
You can do whatever you need to do, man. I'm just nervous. Can I put down my phone?
Absolutely. Yeah. No worries, man. What's your name?
Salehi.
All right, I'm Officer Krug, man.
Nice to meet you, bro.
I'm just gonna check to make sure you don't have any weapons if you don't mind. Okay. Face that way real quick. Put your hands behind your back, palms together like you're praying. Awesome, thank you. All the way like you're praying, Interlace them. Spread your feet. Cool, man. Don't want to mess up those shoes. Those are pretty nice. You said I can search you, right?
You do whatever.
Cool, man.
This is embarrassing, to be frank.
Well, what we like to do, like when we stop someone, we just, to make sure you don't have any weapons or anything, we just like to...
feels a little excessive. What's unfortunate is like I literally designed the shoes that are in this bag and I'm being fucking like searched for. Really? Yeah, I do.
Well, that's why I'm not, like I said, man, you're not in handcuffs or anything, I'm just talking to you right now, okay?
I do, but I'm just walking down the street, that's a little ridiculous.
Well, like I told you though, why, right? Just because
I understand, but the pat down feels excessive, so what else can I do for you guys?
No, just relax, man, like I said, you
Can I
just...
turn around?
Absolutely, yeah. It was just to make sure you didn't have any weapons or anything. I'll just leave it down for now. Well, we'll be done. I just want to see if you had any ID on you, sir. Is it in here?
Yes, it is.
Do you mind if I just pull it out? Yeah. Okay. How do you say your first name, sir? Salehi. Just want to run him real quick, partner, make sure everything checks out okay.
Can I take my phone, please, now? It's like clearly a phone. Is that at least okay?
No, yeah. Sorry. Yeah, if that makes you feel more comfortable, absolutely. Take a look at it.
Yeah, I have to record this because I just don't feel comfortable with that.
Well, just because right now you are being detained, just because we're talking to you,
okay.
And we don't know, not saying that you would do this, but people have called and they have friends come and then it comes an officer safety
I'm literally
issue.
just going to record right now. That's all I'm doing. You see it's recording and that's all I'm doing because I feel, you hear it in my voice, I'm uncomfortable, I'm nervous. You understand the climate that we're in?
No, I understand. Is there anything I can do to make you feel more comfortable?
Not
Like you're not in handcuffs or anything,
not
right?
Not really. Like your boys are pulling up, I'm uncomfortable. I'm not making any like fast movements, but this is uncomfortable for me. Huh?
Are we making any progress?
No, but this is uncomfortable for me. I just want to get to my car, so I'm just going to hit record for you.
Yeah, hey, whatever you want to do, sir. But like I said, you understand why we stopped you, correct? And you admitted to jaywalking?
So I'm in Beverly Hills right now, and I'm getting fucking searched for shopping at the store I work for, and
So
just being
see
black.
now what you're doing is you're making it completely different to
Yeah,
what we just talked about.
Guys,
you're making a completely
so
different
you
narrative.
check my ID. What's going on? Do I have anything on the record?
No, you're good to go, sir.
I'm good to go. That's why.
Yeah, man. But listen, so you can't jaywalk, correct? You
Understood.
understand?
Yeah. Can I have my stuff back, please?
But you see how you just switched that complete narrative?
Nah,
like,
nah.
you were talking to us
I know
saying,
how
yeah,
you
you
guys
can
saw it.
search
Am
me.
I good to go?
Yeah, you're good.
All right. You guys have a good
Next time, don't change the narrative like that, though.
All right. So in the chat, in one word, tell me how watching this film made you feel. Just one word. And Anya will read it out for us.
Tense, angry, nervous, sweaty, angry, stressed, threatened, angry, anxious, outraged, furious, threatened, empathy, frustrated, rage, nervous,
All right.
numb.
And so I'm going to add one more question. I now want everyone to put in the chat, how did you experience these emotions? These are powerful emotions: disgusted, numb, mad, threatened, frustrated, angry, appalled. All of these are emotions, and that we manifest those emotions in our physical body. So where did you carry it in your physical body? So I'll start. Mine is in my stomach. I've seen this like 100 times over, and my stomach is always in knots when I watch it.
A lot of gut and chest. Same for me too. Stomach, pounding heart, gut, stomach. Yep.
Right. Great. We're seeing a lot of repeats come in.
Yeah, a lot of heartbeat, a lot of stomach and gut.
So I'm going to add some that I often get, and you can affirm for me in the chat if any of these resonate with you, right? Your soul, I like that one. But yes, clenched jaw. You could see me doing it in my hands, clenched jaw, clenched fist, right? Shoulders tight, right? You might be shaking, sweaty palms. And I do think we got one of those earlier, right? Thinking about all of the ways this manifests in our physical body, just watching it. And I'm going to come back to these physical manifestations, the pounding heart, right? And people will say that sometimes you can actually see people's, sort of pounding heart, right? Really important for us to think about. All right. And then the third question I want to ask you is, in the chat, tell me, what did you hear Salehi say? So just jot into the chat, and Anya can read them, some of the things that you heard Salehi say to that officer.
I'm uncomfortable. I'm uncomfortable. Super nervous. I'm nervous. I jaywalk. Yep. I'm nervous. No weapons. I'm nervous. Excessive. Uncomfortable and nervous.
Yep.
I'm recording this. I worked at Versace. I designed my shoes.
That's right. That's right. Right?
Can I put my phone down?
Yes. And I saw one earlier. Can I do fill in the blank? He kept asking for permission, right? What an extraordinary impact on one's sense of dignity, right? Having to ask, can I move? Can I turn? Can I reach for my phone? All of the things, right? We take for granted that we would not have to do, right? He was very clear, super nervous, embarrassing, he said at one point. This is a little ridiculous, or the pat down is ridiculous. He said, I'm sorry, I took notes too. Pat down feels excessive. This is all a little ridiculous. He also says over and over, as you all pointed out, he does not feel comfortable. Here's one of the most profound statements he makes. You can hear it in my voice. Don't you understand the climate that we are in? Wow, how powerful is that? And so the question that I want to ask you all is, any of you have teenagers, represent teenagers, work with teenagers, right? How many of you think a teenager could have pulled that off? And I see a couple of you saying he was polite, he was professional, he was correct, he was narrating his movements. How many of you think that a teenager could pull that off the way Salehi Bembury did? Nope. Zero. No way. Exactly. And so not only, a lot of people say, right, not only, right, could a teenager not pull it off? I'm gonna be honest with you, on a bad day, right, as an adult, I might not be able to pull it off as well as he did, right? And so really, I think an important moment for us to understand how this feels. I also want to point out, someone put in the chat, you know, when I asked, so how did your body feel? And they wrote nothing. Someone else asked, does that mean numb? I don't know the answer, what was meant, but I will say that the research, one of the research studies that I even showed you, that some of the responses, right, that you get from this is that you, on the one end of the spectrum, become so numb to all of these moments, right? They've happened so many times that your body shuts down. That is a psychological trauma that is equally as important and is equally damaging to one's sense of self and one's physical as well as mental health, as well as, you know, the reacting as politely and trying to navigate as Salehi did. So all of these fall on the continuum of trauma, and it's really important to understand. So thank you for participating. So the question now, you know, in a, you know, a conversation like this is, what does all of this mean? What does all of this mean for the law, for example, right? What does all of this mean for reform, if you will? But let's, you know, I thought one of the ways that we could tease this out is to think about how this intersection of race, of adolescence, and of trauma impacts really every single stage of a criminal case or of a juvenile case. And here I'm thinking everything from mens rea and state of mind necessary for a finding of criminal culpability. I'm thinking about the validity of a search and seizure. I'm thinking about the voluntariness of a statement made during an interrogation. I'm thinking about sentencing, mitigation at sentencing, post-sentencing, and just so much more. We really could, you know, cover the gamut. But I just wanted to highlight a few to give you a flavor of how this research really matters, right? And so one is to think about for a moment, and I apologize, it looks like my slide got a little off here, but the question is, what offenses, what criminal offenses are deeply impacted by sort of racial trauma? Right. And I'll tell you, and please put some in the chat. Think about, you know, what jumps to your mind, what offenses, what criminal offenses might be impacted by the research that we've just talked about on race and trauma. I'll give you 3 examples. I automatically think resisting arrest, I think about threats charges, and I think about assault on a police officer. So what do I mean by that? Is it really truly resisting arrest if, you know, a suspect, I'll call them that, if a Black or brown child literally refuses to be handcuffed, right? Or pulls away from the officer, right? Is that truly what we mean under the statute of resisting arrest? And I saw one of you put this notion of fight, flight, and freeze. That's what one does when one is terrified, right? So I might lock my body in and refuse to be handcuffed, not because I'm defiant of authority, but because I'm so paralyzed from fear. I think about assault on a police officer, and I think about the statutory definition of assault on a police officer. And I also think about what are the affirmative defenses to assault on a police officer. For example, self-defense. I can speak in my jurisdiction, a client, a defendant, a suspect may use self-defense when they believe that the officer is about to engage in excessive force. Let me ask you, right? Based on this trauma research that we've seen, based on what we know from the realities, right, of contemporary America, how many Black or brown teenagers would fear in the moment that the officer is about to engage in excessive force? A third example that I thought of was threats, right? So when we think about young people, we've already said they're impulsive, they're emotional, they're fairness fanatics, right? So when a police officer talks back, when a teenager talks back to a police officer and that officer interprets it as a threat, the question we all have to ask, is this a true threat, or is this, number one, is it adolescent bravado, right? That's question number one. The second question is it maybe speech that is protected by the First Amendment? What do I mean here? That young people want to speak out in protest of what they believe to be unlawful policing or aggressive policing. And so they speak out in the ways that teenagers do, impulsively, reactively. They might even use profanity. They might speak in ways that sound aggressive. The question has to be, when we factor in this research of race and trauma, is this a true threat under Innocence versus United States, which is the Supreme Court case that actually says that there has to be some subjective intent to actually harm the other, or to carry out the threat. So this adolescent bravado, by itself, arguably would not satisfy that standard. All right. And I really appreciate your, in the chat, putting in some additional offenses or additional violations of police orders that might be impacted by trauma, right? Another sort of line of these cases is what the research has called, and I say research meaning journalists, have coined the phrase contempt of cop, and even some officers adopt the term, but contempt of cop is this idea that you can get arrested for talking back and having attitude with authority figures like law enforcement officers. So what is this all about? It's very common, this contempt of cop concept is this idea that a police officer makes a stop, stops a civilian like any of us on this Zoom, and we feel that it's unfair. Particularly a person of color might feel it's unfair, and they speak out and they say whatever they are going to say, whether it's nice or not nice. And the officer, makes an arrest to demonstrate who's in charge, who has authority, and they call that a contempt of cop arrest. Very often what you will find when they have done studies of these sort of verbal encounters that escalate into an arrest, that there are no drugs involved, no guns involved, no other kind of criminal behavior involved. And so very often these arrests come in as disorderly conduct, disturbing the peace, or loitering, something like that. And so it's very common to see these kinds of offenses, especially with teenagers, right? Because teenagers hang out on the corner and they're loud and unruly. So you can always find something to make an arrest. All right. So just more, I wanted to share that as more evidence or more ways in which young people end up in our juvenile and criminal courts in ways that people often don't realize. So the other thing that I thought would be useful for us to highlight is to think about the ways in which race, adolescence, and trauma impact youth police encounters at the interrogation stage and at the search and seizure stage. And so before I do that, though, I want to introduce one more research phenomena that really builds in some ways on the trauma research, and that is this idea of stereotype threat. Stereotype threat is the demonstrated evidence that very often Black Americans in particular, who have been the subject of these studies, live with the pervasive fear that they will be stereotyped as criminal, or that they will be targeted as criminal solely because of the color of their skin, right? They live in fear of being stopped by the police or called, that a civilian will call 911 on them solely because of their race. Well, the research goes on to say that people who live with this stereotype threat, this fear of being stereotyped, often go out of their way, right, to try to make themselves look less guilty. So the research shows that, you know, a Black male, for example, might even whistle classical music while walking down the street in order to get folks to think that he is not threatening. You know, Black folks will smile awkwardly, avoid eye contact, or otherwise really try to control their behavior, you know, control where they put their arms, things of that nature, in order to deflect attention or to deflect suspicion from them. Unfortunately, the research shows that it's really a vicious vortex, that the more, right, Black folks attempt to avoid suspicion, the more suspicious they look. Right. So the bottom line is people who are anxious about being stereotyped begin to act in ways that make them look anxious and therefore make them look suspicious. So that's what this phenomena of living with stereotype threat is all about. And stereotype threat, the research has been shown to have 3 effects on interrogation. For example, the first one is this idea of stereotype threat impacts the waiver of rights and the voluntariness of statements or confessions. So remember, I just said that people who are afraid of being stereotyped really spend a lot of mental energy trying to prevent other people from thinking that they are guilty. Well, this effort, this mental energy that is being spent actually creates a cognitive overload. That's like all of us when we try to talk, read, listen to our children, chew gum all at the same time, we have a cognitive overload. That cognitive overload reduces one's ability to make a reasoned decision about whether or not to waive rights. It also depletes our cognitive capacity to withstand police pressure. Okay, to withstand police pressure in an interrogation room. And I'm going to do 2 more slides and then we'll read out the verification code, the CLE code for you. All right. But you get the idea. Stereotype threat creates a cognitive overload, impairs one's ability to engage in or to act rationally in an interrogation. The second way that stereotype threat impacts the interrogation context is that it increases the likelihood of a false confession, right? So we've already talked about how sometimes just police presence alone is terrifying, but this notion of stereotype threat added to this notion of police, fear of police, is really complex. In other words, it makes people, Black people and Latina people who've been involved in some of these studies, it makes them believe that no matter what they say, no matter what they do, no matter how they try to defend themselves, they will always be perceived as guilty. And so they are much quicker to make a false confession in order to get out of the interrogation because they're so afraid. And they believe it's just absolutely hopeless to protest their innocence anyway. And then the final way in which the research has shown research shows that stereotype threat impacts interrogation is that it creates this perception that a suspect is lying. This comes back to that cognitive overload problem. Again, when people spend this mental energy trying to disprove what other people are thinking, and they're in their head trying to figure out, what do I say next? Well, research shows people who are anxious in these ways often take longer to speak. They speak more slowly. They stutter or hesitate when they speak. They take too long to make a point, and the police officer can say, see, I told you you cannot keep your story straight. You must be guilty, you must be lying. And so it's just, again, this idea of a vicious vortex that happens that at the intersection of race and trauma. All right, so we talked a little bit about how race and trauma impact interrogation. Let's think about search and seizure for a moment, right? We all know, right, that the Fourth Amendment protects what? Why don't I pause? I'll even pause and take a sip of water, and you can put in the chat. There's a Oh, law school exam. What does the Fourth Amendment protect us from? I feel like I need my Jeopardy music. Do, do, do. Thank you. So unreasonable search and seizures. The key word here is the question of reasonableness, right? And so the Fourth Amendment protects our right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures of our persons, property, papers, and effects. So the question, of course, is then, who is the reasonable person? You can also put in the chat for me, who's a reasonable person? How do we define a reasonable person in the law? Anybody? Who's a reasonable person? The average man. Very good. Right? Right. Someone who the reasonable person standard doesn't apply to. You know where we're going with this, right? I see you all getting to the point. So let me first give you the academic answer, right? That the academic answer, remember this actually is from torts law, right? And has been carried over to criminal law. We all remember this. The one who possesses the intelligence, educational background, level of prudence, and temperament of an average adult. But who really is the reasonable person? Indeed, they probably look like the person in this photograph here. So some of you may be saying, well, wait, Professor Henning, how can you possibly say that? Well, I can say that the Fourth Amendment has been penned or interpreted by the Supreme Court and by state high courts, right? Who, and really until recently, has been predominantly adult, white male, educated, and at least reasonably well off enough because they are a judge. That is who has been traditionally and historically interpreting the Fourth Amendment as we have it today, right? So that is the reasonable person. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is, well, what do we do with a reasonable person standard that fails to account for race and the traumatic effects of police encounters that we have been talking about? What are we to do with a reasonable articulable suspicion standard and a probable cause factors that are deeply impacted by race and police trauma? All right, so let me ask another question. Let's drive this home through practice, right? You know, how do we know? How do we know whether or not a person has been seized or not? Does anybody out there know the standard? How do we know whether someone has been seized for purposes of the Fourth Amendment? All right, you didn't know you were coming to a CLE with so much legal questions from first year law school. But what's, you know, how do we know whether someone has been seized? What's the standard? I love that some of you are clueless. We're going to have other people help. Very good. We've got Jen saying it's whether or not a reasonable person would have felt free to leave, right? So that means all of us, right? For those of us who are not lawyers, basically it means, guess what? You get to walk down the street and you have a right to be left alone until the court, excuse me, the police officer has some reasonable articulable suspicion to seize you. I'm going to come back to that in a moment, but a police officer seizes you, right, when the officer by means of physical force or show of authority has restrained the liberty of a civilian. Right? That is what we call a reasonable person standard. The question is whether or not the police behavior would communicate to a reasonable person that they are free to walk away. Well, most of you can guess what my next question is going to be. Would, right, a reasonable African-American, and let me even add child, would a reasonable African-American child feel free to leave when a police officer walks up to them, right? You all, nope, I already see, I didn't even have to tell you, right? In this climate, no. And that is the reality, right? No reasonable Black child, and I dare say there are very few, adults of color, right? Who would feel free to walk away in today's society. And that is, what we know about the talk, for example. Black parents have really no choice but to advise their kids, look, if you see a police officer, whatever you do, put your hands up. Don't make any sudden movements. Just do whatever they say to get home safe. That is the talk, right? It doesn't matter what class you come in, what neighborhood you live in. They are, taught really to comply with the police. In addition to that, they have grown up watching videos, seeing encounters at their school, seeing encounters in their community, and they know what the consequences of not stopping when the police are present. And so, and then I added for you the research there. And so let me just do a little quick interactive exercise, just because I think it, really drives home the point. I want you all quickly in the chat to react to me and tell me, is this a seizure? Is this a seizure? In other words, does this gentleman here feel free to leave? Yes or no? That's all you have to put, yes or no. That's a seizure. Yes, it is a seizure. And no, they don't feel free to leave. I'm sorry, I did confuse the question, but you all got it right. Yes, this is a seizure. No, they don't feel free to leave. Okay. All right. Next one. Is this a seizure? Does this young person feel free to leave? Nope. Nope, nope, nope. I want you to quickly add into the chat. Very good. Cynthia's already starting to do it. The question is, what factors would lead us to believe y'all are doing it? I love you guys. You all are fabulous. The door is blocked. The officer is standing by the door. The door is closed, right? Blocking access. What other factors? Right? Position of the chair. Exactly. The chairs are facing into each one another. The cops have guns. They're wearing uniforms. There are two officers. Right? What else? Okay. You guys got this. They're standing. Yes. Officer looming over them. Kid has got his arms hidden. All of the things, right? All right. Let me do another one. This gets progressively harder on purpose. Okay. So for this one, is this a seizure or not? All right, yes or no? Is this young person seized here? Getting a whole lot more no's, a lot more probably not. It depends, maybe. All right. So I want you to do the same thing as you're analyzing this. What factors? And some of you have started, well, whose house is it? What's the officer saying? Give me some factors. Cop is sitting awfully close to him. What else? Right? He looks uncomfortable. He looks tense. There we go. Eileen nailed it. Or Ellen, I'm sorry, Ellen Carter nailed it. The kid would not feel free to leave. The question becomes, why not? Why would this child not feel free to leave? Yes, of course it depends, but what did we just say? What did we just say? Would a child, an African-American child, feel free to leave under virtually any circumstance? And it is true. The officer is not scowling. What did I say earlier? Even when the officer is doing a wellness check, even when the officer means well, would the child feel free to leave? Right? I'm going to press the envelope. Let me give you another one. I really press the envelope, don't I? Is this child seized or not? And I'm going to state it differently. Does this child feel free to leave in this photograph? It's the final one. Yes or no? No. All right. So now, so he's being escorted, right? I love Tom. Tom is playing the hardball here, and I appreciate it. So we don't know, right? But the point here that is simply this, that race matters, right? My guess is in this photograph, this is what we call safe passage, where the officers are escorting kids safely from one part of the community to get to their school. The question that I am posing to the group that I really like to press us to think about is if that child did not want to be escorted to school, maybe he's afraid that other kids in the school is going to think he's a snitch. Maybe he has trauma from the presence of police. That officer has gun, has a billy club. There's an officer behind him. Even when the officer is smiling, the question is, does this child feel free to turn around and walk away? So I know I'm being controversial on purpose, but I'm trying to drive home the point here that race matters and this notion of trauma matters more than I think most of us think about and that we calculate. I also want to point out that there have been some cases slowly percolating across the country that have acknowledged that race is relevant at critical Fourth Amendment questions, right? One of those critical Fourth Amendment questions is race and seizure, right? So one of the first cases that we found that acknowledged that race was relevant it was a Seventh Circuit case finding that that indeed race was relevant to the question of seizure when a Black male in an urban area was stopped by the police. The officers asked him, I don't know if that's on the slide, but asked him whether or not, he had a weapon. Mr. Smith knew that any wrong move could result in his immediate death. Okay. And the court in ruling on this acknowledged that race was relevant, right? Another example is at the state level. That was a federal example. Another example in my own jurisdiction. We very recently, we've been litigating this issue for a while, but recently the Court of Appeals issued a ruling stating very, very explicitly that fear of harm is particularly justified by people of color, meaning fear of harm of the police. And that fear of harm is relevant to whether or not there was a seizure and whether or not one feels free to leave. All right. So this is just a sampling of cases, just so you could see how courts are beginning to consider this. Another critical question in the Fourth Amendment or the search and seizure analysis is the consent to search question, right? So I think many of us on this call would say, hey, if the police officer walked up to me and asked me for permission to do a full body search, I would feel free to say no and walk away. Well, the reality is, Black and brown, many Black and brown adults, but certainly Black and brown children do not feel free to decline consent to search. All right. And so I thought I would drive home a story. This is another client that I talk about in my book, The Rage of Innocence, How America Criminalizes Black Youth, is a story about a young kid that I represented named, I call him Andre for purposes of the book. He was a 15-year-old child walking down the street with a friend of his who I call James. A police car drives up, rolls down the window and just yells out to them, hey, did you hear any gunshots? The two boys say no, and they keep on walking. The police car continues to follow them and says, well, can I see your waistband? And what the officers are asking the boys to do is just to lift up their shirts so that they can see, the officers can see whether or not the boys have any weapons in their waistband. Both boys lift up their shirts. They keep on walking. The police officers are still not satisfied. They continue to follow the boys and they say, well, can we search you? At which point these boys say yes. Four police officers get out of the car, push the boys against the wall and frisk them down. And I have to tell you that I'm always quite baffled as an attorney who represents young people. Why did you say yes? There weren't any gunshots. And I should be very, very clear. The police officers testified at the preliminary hearing that there were no gunshots, that the boys weren't laughing, they weren't roughhousing, they weren't being disrespectful, they didn't have any evident weapons, but that the only reason that they did the search was because the boys consented. And so I am baffled, like, why, would you agree to let these officers search you? And our client said, really point blank, Miss Henning, wouldn't you? If we told the officers no, they would have frisked us anyway. And if we tried to run away, they would shoot us in the back, right? This is how so many children perceive these moments, right? He was flat out like, I really had no choice but to consent to that search. And so the question becomes whether or not that meets the standard, the legal standard for voluntary consent, right? And so what does the law say, right? The law says that the police officers must show that consent was freely given, not the result of express or implied duress or coercion, right? That was an old fundamental Supreme Court case in 1973. I will be very honest with you. Until I became intentional about understanding how race impacts the law, I never paid attention to the next part I want to read out of Bustamante. And that is this, that the Supreme Court said that the consent analysis not only involves this reasonable, objective person standard, but it also involves some subjective inquiry that takes into account personal experiences that drive fears and motivate people to act. It is that language that I had not paid attention to be quite frank, that allows us, right, to raise race and to raise adolescence, or not so much raise, but to consider, that invites us to consider the impact, the subjective impact of race and adolescence. It goes on to say that we must also consider the possibly vulnerable subjective state of the person who consents, right? So this is absolutely right. Gina says that Salehi did not believe at any moment that he could withhold consent. They tried to tell him at the beginning, oh, this is just, we just want to chat with you since you were jaywalking. And then when he begins to even suggest, right, that maybe I can go on about my way, they were like, no, you can't pick up your phone because you're detained, right? How the story switches, right? And yet they want to say that he's the one who's switching the narrative. So they very much gaslit him. But the bottom line here is, again, no reasonable Black child, right, feels free to decline consent. I would go so far as to argue that every request for consent in contemporary society becomes some form of implied duress or coercion, so that it's not voluntary as the law would require it. So we need to think about how race matters in the law. So just by way of summary, when we think about consent, whether it's consent for an interrogation, waiver of rights, whatever it is, that we have to consider the traumatic effects of policing, and the ways in which that trauma produces anxiety, stress, panic decision-making that reduces one's ability to make a rational decision about waiver. And then also this notion of stereotype threat and how that creates a cognitive overload, feelings of hopelessness, right? So I never feel free to decline consent and walk away. All right, so I talked about I mentioned reasonable articulable suspicion. And as we know, we are free to walk about society, walk about our neighborhoods, walk in and out of our school without reasonable unless the police have reasonable articulable suspicion to believe that we have engaged in some criminal behavior, or probable cause to believe that we have engaged in some criminal behavior, right? So let me ask you, and I want you to come back to the chat feature, and I want you to put in the chat, what are some of the most common reasons, right? For the lawyers in the room, what are some most common reasons that police officers give for a stop and frisk? And for those of you who aren't lawyers who are listening on television, in the neighborhood, what are the most common reasons that people are stopped and frisked by the police? So let's pause and put some of those in the chat. And Anya can read some of these.
I see traffic violation, match a description. Yep, fit a description, suspicious activity in the area. Acting nervous. Yep, behaving suspicious. Messaging to the community about police being on board, broken taillights. Mhm. Probable cause.
So one of the things that I noticed in your list is so many of them are very, very broad. Suspicious behavior, probable cause, behaving suspiciously. These are not what would constitute reasonable, articulable suspicion, right? But that is very often what we see the language being used to justify. And there's a great deference to officers who say that someone was behaving suspiciously. But some of the other ones that you're giving and that Anya has been reading are very precise, like behaving, well, I don't know how precise this is, but a little bit more, acting nervous, right? Tail lights, matching a description. And then I think, Anya, we got some new ones in.
Yeah, I did see some. Oh, yeah, running from a crime scene is a good one. Wearing a hoodie, seeing a bulge that could be a weapon. And because they can, I like that one.
Yeah, that's right, because they can. So what you see here is, and everywhere I have trainings or workshops and CLEs like this, we get the same sort of set of rationales. High crime area, running from the police, failure to respond to the police, furtive gestures, nervousness, right? Tips from informants, proximity to a crime scene, all the traffic ones that you all listed, right? A bulge, right? Gunshots, just like they asked my client, right? So somewhere in the neighborhood, I heard gunshots. So therefore, right, that's my justification to stop you. So I want to do, so let me ask you, pressing yourself, how many on this list are what we call proxies for race? And so what in the world do I mean by a term for that? What I simply mean is that factors that are so closely correlated with race that I might as well have said that I stopped them because of their race. So just to give you two, and you all can put some more in the chat, which of these become proxies for race? So for example, high crime neighborhood, if you deem an entire, yep, Susan said it too, if you deem an entire neighborhood of African-American neighborhood as a high crime area, then that becomes one of your justifications for a stop. Association with known offenders. Well, an over police neighborhood, is whether you're guilty or not guilty, you live in a community of a lot of people who've been stopped by the police. And so understanding. So what are some of the other proxies for race I see in here? Right? Matching descriptions, wearing hoodies, and very often, right, a hoodie is a sign that they must be wearing oversized clothing in order to hide, guns within that hoodie. Well, it's a hip hop style. Actually, what I'll say more about this in a moment, but a hoodie is worn by, girls who go to yoga class. It's worn by, college football players on their way to football practice, right? But yet it becomes a proxy for race when we talk about hoodies in Black neighborhoods being a sign that they must have a concealed weapon, right? Okay. Oh, put the list back up, someone is asking, right? For us to think about it, right? Right? So how many of these are proxies for race? All right. Let me press you guys, all of them. Thank you, Catherine. That's usually the answer I'm waiting for. In a lot of ways, and I don't mean to be flip, or dismissive, that a lot of them have become proxies for race, right? At least most of them, given especially the intersection of race, trauma, and reasonable articulable suspicion, right? So some of you are talking about running, right? So think about it, right? These are uniquely, and look at this little meme here. Children, like we said, are taught Black children almost from birth to run, from the police, which is really, isn't that interesting, right? It is a catch-22. It is literally what we call a Hobson's choice. Black children are told to comply with the police no matter what. Yet the fear and trauma leads to impulsive adolescent responses, magical thinking. Let me see if I can outrun the police. So literally, it is, you see kids doing both things: freezing, fight, flight, or freeze. You see all of it. All of it is a manifestation of the trauma that we're talking about, okay? And so the question becomes whether or not it is appropriate to consider things like flight as consciousness of guilt or as reasonable articulable suspicion to believe that somebody has committed a crime. Well, some of you may remember that the Supreme Court in 2000 decided in Illinois versus Wardlow that yes, it was appropriate for police officers to infer consciousness of guilt from flight and from nervousness. But guess what? Even then, Justice Stevens, in his concurring opinion, recognized, whoa, that's a real slippery slope. He, in that concurring opinion, noted that among some citizens, particularly minorities, there is also the possibility that a fleeing person is entirely innocent, maybe because they believe that contact with the police can in and of itself be dangerous. So that was back in 2000 in the concurring opinion to the lead Supreme Court case, right? That said flight was consciousness of guilt. Now, just 23 years later, courts have slowly begun to recognize that Justice Stevens was spot on. And slowly you're seeing state high courts begin to roll back some of that commitment to flight as consciousness of guilt. So the first state high court was Massachusetts. Commonwealth versus Warren held that the defendant in that case did not behave in an inherently suspicious manner simply by running away from the police. That court cited to Boston Police Department data and ACLU reports demonstrating racially discriminatory policing in that community. That was really important in them sort of beginning to say, flight alone is no longer consciousness of guilt. We had a case out of Vermont in 2019, noting that nervousness was only minimally relevant in the probable cause analysis. And it went on to cite the concurrence from Justice Stevens. I should tell you that we have a case similar in DC, and we have been collecting at Georgetown, doing 50 state searches, trying to find examples of these cases that are slowly beginning to recognize that race is not only relevant to seizure, but it's also relevant to consent, and it's also relevant to reasonable articulable suspicion. And so let me just say a couple of more things about this reasonable articulable suspicion. And that is this: I want to tie it back to stereotype threat. So beyond flight, right? Beyond flight, remember, and trauma, remember that we talked about stereotype threat and how people who are anxious about being stereotyped, how people who are traumatized by police contacts, how they manifest. We call those stereotype threat responses and trauma responses, right? And if you look up on my slide and see the circle here, you see that folks who live with, who have trauma responses and stereotype threat responses exhibit rapid and shallow breathing, clenched fists, trembling extremities, jaw clenches, fidgeting, pacing, blinking, repetitive phrases, shortened breath. So what does this sound like? Who else was doing that in this presentation? Anybody remember? This isn't the first time we've seen this list. You all remember Salehi Bembury and us. We were, thank you, Catherine, as we watched that video. We watched the video of Salehi being stopped. We had so many of these symptoms, and he certainly did. Now, these very symptoms, these trauma symptoms, stereotype threat responses, are being used as evidence of reasonable articulable suspicion. And researchers actually demonstrated this by collecting a series of police training manuals and training videos and the like. And what they found was that police officers were being asked to look for the very same things that lined up with trauma responses and stereotype threat responses. Yet, police officers were never trained about trauma and about stereotype threat. So to be very clear, police officers were being trained to look for avoiding people who avoid eye contact, people who are scratching their head, touching their face, clenching their fist, breathing rapidly, shaking uncontrollably, repetitive phrases. They're being trained to look for those as indicators of threat or suspicion, when in fact, those are really very often for Black and brown folks, those are trauma responses. And to sort of add insult to injury, if you will, or to further complicate the situation, we've got evidence or research demonstrating how implicit racial bias causes people to interpret those behaviors, those trauma responses and stereotype threat responses, as confirming what they already believe to be true about Black and brown folks. Again, have you noticed this vicious vortex keeps coming back? So not only do I feel anxious, I act in ways that make me look anxious, I look suspicious. Oh, and by the way, because you're Black and brown, I believe your behavior must be because you are criminal. And so several studies have demonstrated that individuals, including civilians and police officers, interpret ambiguous facial expressions and innocuous behaviors as violent and aggressive, while interpreting those exact same behaviors by white civilians as completely harmless. All right. The research also shows that participants or civilians and police officers are more likely to misinterpret an innocuous object being held in my hand as a Black woman as a weapon, right? Because it's associated with the Black face. Whereas if that same innocuous object, uncertain, ambiguous object is held by a white person, you're less likely to perceive it as a weapon. I should also tell you that the research shows that all of us, civilians and police officers, are more likely to perceive a Black male as stronger, heavier, more muscular, more capable of physical harm than a white male. So I was showing you those pictures, right? To show you two males who were the exact same height, exact same weight, and exact same body build, but in studies after studies, they'll show that people perceive that Black male to be bigger, taller, heavier, more muscular. And that helps explain why Black males are more likely to be stopped, frisked, searched, and experience some sort of use of force. Similarly, research shows that Black Americans, especially like Black teenagers hanging out in a park, Black teenagers hanging out on the street corner, are more likely to be stopped in a group than white youth in a group are likely to be stopped. And the research more specifically showed that Black people in a group are more likely to experience, again, frisk, search, arrest, and use of force. What is really important about these studies is that they have found that Black folks in a group are no more likely to be found with contraband than white folks stopped in a group. Right. So it's not that these more frequent or racially disparate stops are producing more contraband or evidence of criminal behavior. It's simply our racial biases lead us to believe that Black folks in a group are more dangerous. So just a couple of more studies before I close this out and give you all an opportunity to ask questions is I want to just show you two studies that show how young people, teenagers, Black and Latino teenagers in particular, are impacted by these implicit bias studies. One study that I think everyone who works in the field, who's a lawyer, either in a criminal case or in juvenile case, or a judge or probation, whatever your role is, needs to understand is that the studies show that both civilians and law enforcement officers perceive Black youth to be older than they actually are. And I should start with Black boys. This study I'm showing you here found that civilians and police officers perceive Black boys to be more than 4.5 years older than they actually are. And so folks will remember Tamir Rice. The officers, after they shot Tamir Rice, kept talking about how he looked older than his 12 years old or 12 years in age. And research was done right after that, showing that indeed Tamir is not alone. Many folks perceive Black youth older than they actually are. So 12-year-old Tamir Rice is perceived to be, 16, 17-year-olds. But think about a 17-year-old who is every bit a child is perceived to be adult when you add 5 years to that age. Similar research has been done involving Black girls, showing that adults perceive Black girls to be older, more mature, more knowledgeable about adult topics than they actually are, less innocent, less in need of protection, all of that. All right. So I just wanted to share that with you. I gave you some examples. We looked at search and seizure. We looked at interrogation. We looked at, mens rea, criminal culpability, and we see how race, adolescence, and trauma are relevant in all of those stages. But that's not the only stages. And you can just see, you can just look and think for yourself how race impacts and adolescent impacts every stage of a case. So what I will say to you as I bring this to a close is that I have some handouts I am happy to send to Judge Bott, to Anya, and any others who are on the committee that really summarize in very plain language the stereotype threat, policing as trauma research, some of the research that I gave you. I'm happy to share that with folks who are interested in that. And as Anya said, the book, The Rage of Innocence, How America Criminalizes Black Youth, I summarize this language or this research and more in very plain language, and I apply it to the cases and to the young people and to the stories that I tell about my clients and about other high-profile young Black children who have been arrested in the United States. I think we have about maybe 5 minutes or so. If folks want to ask questions, I'm happy to answer.
I'm seeing a lot of praise in the chat. So thank you so much. I definitely found the presentation very insightful. So I see one question here from Abram, who asked if you can discuss the changes that were made by Congress in the District of Columbia Criminal Code and how they affect adolescents.
Oh, so interesting. So I have to start by saying the most devastating news. I don't know if you've heard, but the United States Congress, for the first time in over 30 years, has intervened to veto our criminal code revision. So I just wanted to point that out. We are figuring out how that's going to evolve. But how does the criminal code revision in DC was really one of the most powerful revisions. And one of the ways it impacts adolescence was it would give a lot more opportunities for what we call second look. We now know more about adolescent brain development than we did when we first wrote the criminal code. And so with that new research, they want to give people who are serving long sentences for behaviors that they engaged in when they were a teenager, they want to give those folks an opportunity to come back to court and say, look, I am rehabilitated, or I am, the adolescent brain development would have led to a shorter sentence. So that's one of the main ways that the criminal code would have impacted, or would, maybe it's still hope, would impact adolescents.
Yeah, I think that's super important too. So I see a couple more questions. One, Susie asked, which I think is a good one, is there a difference between urban and suburban in the issues in the statistics that you mentioned?
Oh, great question. And so I think the answer is no, there is no difference. And I say that because of what I said earlier, that these studies have begun, not even begun, they control for class, ethnicity. I believe they control for geographic region. I could be wrong about this, but let me be clear. Every single study that has been done, internationally and domestically, has demonstrated that the key, if this is what you're asking, I apologize if not, but that the key features of adolescence are persistent across all of the different variables. If you are asking me about racial disparities, and if that's the stats that you're asking about urban versus suburban, the answer is unequivocally yes, that in fact, in rural areas, for example, where there are very, very few children of color, Black children, you will see racial disparities are astronomical. So it's almost counterintuitive. The smaller in number, the smaller in raw numbers that you have of a population, the more racially disparate. So take New Mexico. I did some training a while back in New Mexico. Very few, like a very small percentage of African Americans live in New Mexico. Yet the racial disparity numbers is just literally off the charts, right? So it's sort of counterintuitive, but it's amazing. It's amazing how that works. So I'm not sure which of those two questions you were asking. Someone asked about where to get the book.
I was going to say,
yeah.
I see the link here for the Penguin Random House link, and then also Amazon. So I don't know if you have a preference.
No, I don't. I just want folks to read and understand race and adolescence and policing. So yes, it's at Penguin Random House. It's also available on Amazon. It's available at independent bookstores. It's really pretty much everywhere you can buy books.
Awesome. Well, I thank you so much. I thought that this was absolutely amazing. I think there was one last question, if you could quickly answer it. And they just asked what your thoughts were on restorative justice and that place in the juvenile justice system.
Yes. So I would say I am in favor of restorative justice, but what I like to remind people is that true restorative justice occurs before you have a criminal charge. In other words, it's a way of keeping kids out of the system. And I think what we too often do is we call things restorative justice, right? That really aren't quite restorative justice. So for example, restorative justice is not, a group of adults getting in a room with a teenager and saying, you shouldn't have done that and you better go apologize. That's not restorative justice. True restorative justice are programs, for example, that are set up in school systems, right? Before you, instead of referring my client Sharice to court, you have a restorative intervention at the schoolhouse or at the community center, at the church, somewhere like that. You don't send the kid to school. To the courthouse with an arrest.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Chris. And for those of you watching, I do encourage you to get a copy of the book. I'm definitely going to get one. I got a chance to look at the preview and watch some of her prior interviews, and I think this is definitely going to be a great read. So thank you so much. I want to thank all of you for joining us today for this session. And I also want to thank our speaker for sharing their knowledge and expertise, and the Connecticut Bar Association and the Connecticut Bar Foundation for hosting this speaker series. Follow the CBA and the CBF communications for more information about upcoming Motley series events. Please see the chat for more information about this event, as well as this session's verification codes and survey. We thank you all. and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you, everybody. It was great to be with you.